still do see landowner and resident concerns, voiced pretty vocally at times. This will only increase once we have a more formal federal process for drone corridors and later advanced air mobility corridors. So it's important that state and local officials and federal officials prepare a policy framework that will recognize the legal realities and expectations of residents, but also find a way to have corridors where companies can know with certainty they can operate at high throughputs.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 390. Are drone highways gaining momentum? For that question, we head to Virginia to speak with Brenk Skorup, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. The Mercatus Center is a research center at George Mason University that advances knowledge about how markets solve problems and help us lead happier, healthier, and richer lives. For more than 40 years, research at Mercatus has strived to realize a world where markets operate at their full potential to increase abundance, civility, and well-being. The growing use of unmanned aerial vehicles has spurred a new UAS framework called Highways in the Sky. Drone highways in the sky are essentially designated air corridors that are reserved for the exclusive use of unmanned aerial vehicles. The idea is that these corridors would allow drones to fly autonomously without the need for direct human supervision while avoiding other aircraft and structures in the national airspace. One of the key benefits of drone highways in the sky is that they could significantly increase the efficiency and safety of drone operations. By providing a clear and well-defined path for drones to follow, drone highways could reduce the risk of collisions and enable drones to fly faster and more efficiently, potentially opening up new opportunities for commercial drone use. But the concept is still in the early stages of development, and there are many different ideas and approaches being explored by researchers, regulators, and industry stakeholders. Brent has published several research papers on the topic of drone highways in the sky. His research has covered the economic, regulatory, and legal opportunities and constraints related to drone highways. In 2019 and 2022, he published a survey that assessed the regulatory environment for drones in all 50 U.S. states and evaluated each state's readiness to support the growth and development of the drone industry. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Brent talks about drone highways in the sky, their potential benefits, and the challenges local, state, and federal policymakers may have in advancing the UAS industry while responding to varied stakeholder interests. But before we hear from Brent, I want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And by the way, if you have a great story on the use of drones that you'd like to share in a podcast, contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. Now let's learn about drone highways in the sky with Brenk Skorup of the Mercatus Center. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Brent to introduce himself.
My name is Brenk Skorup. I'm a senior research fellow and an attorney at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
Brent, tell us about the Mercatus Center.
We're a research center affiliated with George Mason University. Been around several decades now. We've got several scholars working on things including banking and cryptocurrencies and regulatory analysis. And generally speaking, we approach things from a free market perspective. Mostly PhD economists at Mercatus. I'm one of a handful of attorneys.
And how long have you been with Mercatus?
Almost 10 years now. working on emerging technology, transportation technology, and telecom.
Over the past year, the term drone highway in the sky has really emerged in a variety of different contexts. You've done a lot of research in this area. So can you share, what do you consider to be a drone highway in the sky?
Yeah, from my point of view, and you're seeing these, this concept pop up globally, not just in the United States, although I think the United States has unique regulatory and legal reasons to support drone highways. This is designated three-dimensional columns of air where drones, and increasingly we're talking about advanced air mobility, but we'll stick to drones for now, but where drones can fly. And the purpose, generally speaking, is to avoid conflicts with other types of air traffic, but also conflicts related to trespass, nuisance, and other types of conflicts with landowners and residents.
Is it a swath of airspace at a certain level where drones can fly? Or is it actually a corridor that follows a predefined geography?
It's an open question, what will develop in time, but what you're seeing right now is dedicated corridors, and there's various reasons for that. But for the initial steps, what you're seeing are dedicated corridors between, say, businesses or hospitals, island delivery, but you're seeing different models, but generally dedicated corridors. In the future, I expect you'll see a more liberalized approach with larger swaths of airspace.
How are drone corridors created?
It's been fairly ad hoc to date, I think it's fair to say. And I saw last year, actually, some FAA officials talked about formalizing the process, because this ad hoc process, you have to reinvent the wheel every time. If you're a commercial provider, if you're a state or city who wants to create a corridor, you have to start from zero. So last year, the FAA announced a process formalizing this. Frankly, it's not clear to me, even someone who watches this pretty closely, what that process looks like. But I was happy to hear last year the FAA announced they're formalizing this process where public and private participants can go to the FAA and have a streamlined approach to creating these drone corridors.
What are some of the benefits of creating a drone corridor?
So there are operational benefits, related to UTM, unmanned traffic management, in that you greatly simplify operations if you have a corridor to yourself, if you're an operator. In the future, there might be some interoperability requirements, but those will be what we might call thin interoperability requirements, say notice of off nominal, or, drones getting outside the corridor. Whereas you can imagine a very more complicated but thick interoperability where you have to communicate constantly with other types of drone operators and UTM companies. So one benefit of corridor is, again, a simplified process of drone traffic management where you're the sole manager of the corridor. There's also, from my perspective, where I largely focus, is there's legal benefits to corridors. The fact is, under U.S. law, is black letter law, that, as the Supreme Court said in the 1940s, landowners own the immediate reaches above their land. And so, it's never been defined what the immediate reaches means, but by having corridors, you can, vertically ascend on your own property, get to higher altitude airspace outside the immediate reaches, or even into controlled airspace, and then you're only dealing with the FAA at that point. But you can avoid nuisance, trespass, privacy, litigation if you're in a corridor, and if you're using at low altitudes only property you control or property you have permission to access.
As a city planner, you raise an interesting point. In the future, a commercial owner might want to locate a vertiport on top of one of their buildings to allow package delivery or even advanced air mobility vehicles to operate. Adjacent property owners may have concerns, or even may oppose such operations. So while the airspace may not necessarily be a focus of regulation, the location and operation parameters could easily fall within a local government's zoning code.
Yeah, exactly. So corridors simplify the analysis somewhat, in that once you have an ideal corridor, you've got a few options depending on where you define immediate reaches. You can go to those landowners. either get permission, purchase a navigation easement, which is pretty common in traditional aviation. If you're an airport manager and you want to extend a runway, for instance, in many cases, you have to purchase a navigation easement from adjacent landowners. And the process would be similar if you say you want a drone port or a vertiport. A corridor indicates where you need the air rights or property rights to have glide paths onto your property.
How does the siting of vertiports fit into the concept of drone highways? Is there a relationship?
Yeah, they're certainly related. And a lot of it depends on how specifically, you designate a corridor. They're certainly related. I think probably the better approach is, at the federal level, essentially green light, broad swaths of airspace where there's not going to be interference with existing air traffic. And then federal and state and local aviation officials together start designating where corridors might be. And then in the future, and this is, more distant in the future, but you might have something like airspace leasing or auctions to companies who then have those corridors themselves, and they can locate vertiports where it makes the most sense, consistent with land use rules. But certainly related.
Drone highways in the sky are not new. Last year, the United Kingdom announced plans for a 160-mile drone superhighway called Project Skyway. The project is being led by Altitude Angel and involves a consortium of major stakeholders.
In the U.S., you have similar projects. I'll point you to New York State has a 50-mile-long corridor connecting Syracuse and Rome, New York. And actually, the FAA and Governor of New York recently announced the first advanced air mobility international corridor connecting Syracuse International Airport with an airport outside Montreal. There's one in Oklahoma, 110-mile long corridor just announced. But you see these popping up, and I think it's great. And it resembles the UK project that you mentioned.
The examples you cited are being established as demonstration projects to primarily work through the partnerships, technology, and operational aspects. Do you think they can provide a model that can be replicated throughout the country?
Yeah, I think this is the way that we're headed. I can say for advanced air mobility, certainly, the NASA concept of operations expressly envisions dedicated corridors for advanced air mobility. And for small drones, again, you see these corridors popping up, first for testing purposes and the hope is for commercial purposes in the future. But yeah, again, I think for operational reasons, again, the simplicity of UTM, but also to mitigate litigation risk. Yeah, the corridor model makes a lot of sense, which is why I think you see it popping up. And I should add also plans in states like Ohio and Michigan and others that are planning drone corridors. I think it's promising development. I'll also add, actually, this was a bill released last week by Senators Warner and Senator Thune, a Democrat Republican. But they have a bill. It's got a few items in it, including a new office at the FAA. But part of the bill would require, it's not passed yet, it's just a bill, but the bill would require the FAA to expedite BVLOS, beyond visual line of sight operations at low altitudes. And they say below 100 feet in many circumstances. And, for listeners, who follow this closely, this will sound familiar. This was a recommendation from the BVLOS Aviation Rulemaking Committee last year to have these, what they call shielded areas below 100 feet, essentially these corridors below 100 feet. So this has been recommended by federal advisory bodies. Now it's even been introduced in federal law. So I think it's a promising way forward to have this corridor system.
Can you describe the research that you've undertaken on drone highways?
I've put out for a couple of years. We've ranked all 50 states on their commercial drone readiness, and that's an attempt to get state aviation officials and state lawmakers thinking about preparing themselves for drone commerce, specifically medical logistics and home delivery, in ways to prepare a state, including things like creating a drone task force or an advanced air mobility task force, but also thinking about these issues of how do you protect the privacy and property interests of landowners and residents? Things like clarifying the extent of air rights and having navigation easements if you're high enough to you're not a nuisance or invading property at low altitudes. And that's been a very fruitful research project. There's been a lot of interest in those areas, particularly in the past year. I would add, as part of that research, I was on the Texas Department of Transportation's Urban Air Mobility Advisory Committee, and we just released our report a few months ago. And I think having an advisory committee like that is something all states should have, as these new legal issues and commercial issues, whether they like it or not, are going to come to state aviation offices soon. Yeah, there's been a lot of progress in the past year. The governors of Arkansas, Oklahoma have teamed up in a novel way, creating some interstate memorandum of agreement to work together on these things. So, there's a tremendous amount happening. And then on top of that, you have at the federal level, the FAA reauthorization, and probably, most of that will deal with traditional aviation, but there probably will be some elements of advanced air mobility and drones.
Did the report issued by the Texas Urban Air Mobility Advisory Committee include drone highways?
It does talk about drone highways and some of the property rights implications of drones at low altitudes, especially in a state like Texas. I mean, they're kind of independent streak, and which large ranchers and property owners are, and I think correctly, concerned about protecting their property and privacy rights. So, it was a hot topic of discussion in Texas and in many other states. I've talked with aviation officials and lawmakers in many states, and this is front of mind, which is striking that balance of, again, protecting the property and privacy interests of residents and landowners, but also finding a way to promote and encourage drone commerce. And I think it can be done, I think, through corridors, I think through recognizing air rights at low altitudes, but recognizing navigation easements at higher altitudes. I think in this way, you can strike that balance, because the real estate bar and landowners they're a powerful interest group and are having an effect on state drone policies.
A recent example of that, I think, comes from Wyoming, where the state legislature considered a bill that would make it a crime for drone pilots to fly over private property. The bill did not pass, but it does show an interest by some constituents to restrict drone flights.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even with a relatively few pilot projects out there, you still do see landowner and resident concerns, voiced pretty vocally at times. This will only increase once we have a more formal federal process for drone corridors and later advanced air mobility corridors. So it's important that state and local officials and federal officials prepare a policy framework that will recognize, again, the legal realities and expectations of residents, but also find a way to have corridors where companies can know with certainty they can operate at high throughputs. And I think we'll get there shortly, but it does require some due diligence and some legal research.
In terms of policy initiatives, what might we see in the near future related to drone highways?
If Senator Warner and Thune's bill is any indication, I think you will see a formalized process for state, local, and federal authorities to work together on creating these drone corridors. And that would be a great development. The fact is, there's a lot of gray area about the extent of private property rights. Again, the Supreme Court said landowners own the immediate reaches, and that's never been defined. And hopefully in time, state lawmakers and federal lawmakers will bring some clarity to that. You also have state aviation officials working with federal aviation officials, again, on ad hoc basis, sometimes very collaboratively, other times, I'll give one public example. The USDOT Inspector General's office had a report about some of the federal drone pilot programs. They noted a very concerning fact that in one instance, the state went to the FAA asking if a proposed state law, it's not clear what the law was, but a proposed state law would conflict with federal drone policies. This was in 2018, the Inspector General said. And here we are 4 years later, and the Inspector General said there's been no response from the FAA about whether this state law would conflict with federal policy. So That's alarming enough if you're a state. It's particularly alarming if you're a drone startup. If states are waiting 4 years for a response from a federal agency, if you're a startup dependent on venture capital or your own cash and you're burning that for years with no response, that's an alarming reality. So I hope in the next year, you'll see more formalized processes with state and aviation and federal aviation officials working together on these corridors and start lighting these up and start getting commercial operations so that companies can go to their funders and to other agencies and say, we have proof of concept, we've flown this many flights and we've done it, BVLOS. It's still early, but I hope in the next year or two, we'll have a lot more corridors and a lot more testing and also commercial services.
Last year, the Ford Motor Company applied for a patent for a drone highway in the sky for operational parameters. Are you aware of it?
Yeah, I saw some media about the patent. And like you, I've seen this drone highway concept being popularized, particularly in the past year, not just in the US, but globally. I think the Ford patent signals that there is mainstream acceptance and acknowledgement of this idea, at least for the time being, of the need for drone corridors. And, there are operational and legal benefits to doing this. And, I hope federal and state aviation officials will make note of that. And, there are some promising signs. But no, I think it's a good sign of the maturation of this idea. And again, hopefully in the next year, we'll see a lot more commercial operations making use of drone highways.
How should policymakers and industry leaders prepare for drone highways?
I'll just, close by encouraging for the local officials and state officials out there to create these working groups, these drone advisory bodies, and also advanced air mobility advisory bodies, because again, whether they like it or not, these drone legal issues and commercial issues and advanced air mobility issues are coming, and they involve a lot of questions dealing with city planning, with property rights, with land use, and it's important that state and local officials are prepared for when this technology is deployed in commercial.
On another topic, you recently presented to the Internet of Things Evolution Expo on smart cities and infrastructure. Any connection to drones?
So there is a relationship to drones and connected vehicles with smart cities. As I see it, and I think many analysts and technologists who are working in this field, you have a nice coinciding development of a few factors for smart cities. Fiber optics and 5G everywhere, essentially at this point. You also see the emergence of low-cost sensors, LiDAR, radar, and other types of sensors. And then in parallel, the development of autonomous vehicles and drones. And so all of this is coinciding, I hope, for a smart city environment where you can have connected vehicles making use of the fiber optics and the LiDAR and the radar, providing services to drones, to autonomous vehicles. And so I was invited to speak, as you mentioned, at the IoT Evolution Expo. I talked about some of the obstacles I see with smart city developments, including most notably, aside from the financing challenges, but one is people get very nervous about smart cities and data collection. I mean, smart cities involve cameras and connectivity. And so my view of this is you can avoid a lot of the bad press about smart cities and a lot of the public resistance if you quarantine the public and the private sectors. And in my view, the public sector, the local transportation offices, the local city planners should be laser focused on what I call dumb infrastructure, what my colleague, my co-author, Professor Gray, and I call dumb infrastructure. And this is the public rights of way, the fiber optics conduit, perhaps even the dark fiber in some cases, but be laser focused on the rights of way issues and ensuring competitive access, fair access to these, but then staying almost entirely out of the device sector. And the device sector, I think, should be almost entirely private, with some exceptions for like traffic signaling and metering of parking spots. But aside from some narrow exceptions, the device sector should be almost entirely private. There should be no public involvement with that, except as a purchaser of services. But the connectivity, the LiDAR, the radar, the cameras, that should be privately deployed. And the public sector should stay away from that, again, aside from as a purchaser of services. And I think you solve a few problems with smart cities that way. You avoid the kind of constitutional and legal issues and creepiness of government collecting all this data. And you also provide a free hand to the device companies, to the network, the connectivity companies to develop and monetize their services in a pretty free way. So that's why I presented at the conference. I got a very nice reception, and I hope this model, provides some case studies of where you see this, but I hope this model will be followed nationwide of dumb infrastructure with a strong federal and state component, and perhaps even funding, but then a free hand to the device and connectivity companies.
Are you aware of any models in the United States that use this concept?
So you've seen this with broadband connectivity in a few places. I would point listeners to Lincoln, Nebraska. They've taken this dumb infrastructure approach where they have neutral host conduit, and they had 11 broadband providers, private companies using the neutral host conduit that the city invested in. It was successful enough that they're expanding it throughout the entire county, not just in downtown Lincoln. Arizona, the governor Ducey in Arizona, and the transportation office is doing this along 200 miles of interstate. They're installing conduit and some fiber for their own services, but then they're leasing the excess fiber to private companies, or the excess conduit. And then finally, in New York City, actually, you see, I would say, a progression of the model. It's not just landline fiber optics. They're doing this with 5G antenna bays. They're funding and installing these 32-foot antenna bays with 5 bays. They're leasing out the bays to 5G providers and other wireless providers. And I think that's a welcome progression of this model. And I hope in time, other more advanced technologies like LiDAR and cameras and radar will be incorporated into this dumb infrastructure model. But time will tell.
That's it for episode 390 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Brenk Skorup of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I want to thank Brent for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Mercatus Center or want to connect with Brent, check out the webpage at mercatus.org. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.